Good evening, everybody. Once again, it is I, Nick, Pennsylvania, here as I most often am with my good friend Brendan Bond. Good evening, Brendan.
Good evening, Nick.
It is a dark evening. We got a little bit of rain as I'm looking out over the churchyard outside my window. I am going to warn the two of you because we have somebody very special I'm excited to announce, but I need to warn the two of you as well as anybody listening that my daughter is currently at a dance with a few of her friends.
Ooh.
And at some point later this evening, there may be screaming. There's nothing to be worried about. This is typical, is what I've been led to understand. But I'm very excited because we have a local professor, folklorist, author, returning to have another conversation with us. We have been excited to welcome back Thomas White almost as long as since we last saw one another, had our first conversation, where you had mentioned something that we can just not let go of. How are you this evening?
I'm doing pretty good. I know what that thing is that you don't want to let go of is probably due to the curse of the werewolf, but I know you guys were interested in the werewolf folklore of Pennsylvania and the authentic folklore that came over here over the years.
Yeah, because when you mentioned that, I was struck because both Brendan and I were not really familiar right out of the gate. Like, we have read and we have heard a lot of big cat folklore going back at least to some of the books I have from the late 19th century and well into like the Keystone Folklore Quarterly from the mid 60s. But big cat lore, I went back and I found one story that was collected by Shoemaker, and part of me wants to have a whole other conversation about Shoemaker because every time we bring him up, we bring up this whole preamble about
this caveat. Yeah,
right. Like, Shoemaker is a questionable figure, but we read his Black Wolf of Oak Valley, so really interested about this werewolf folklore. And as I recall, you specifically said of northern Pennsylvania in particular. Am I wrong in my memory?
Yeah, north central and northern Pennsylvania. I mean, it's all over. It's there's cases in like central PA, north central, Clinton County. I've heard rumors of stories that no longer exist from center and up in the kind of the Pennsylvania wilds, as they call it, the area up front. The really northern part.
Yeah, the northern tier.
Yeah, there's stories from like Mercer and Venango, that area. There's stuff from Northumberland. There's stuff from Blair County. So there's stories spread out all over the place in Pennsylvania.
So just before we get into some of these stories, I'm curious about a couple things right out of the gate, because one of the things we talked about when you were first here and you got us wise to was that this area is a pretty good place for collecting folk tales, and one of those factors was because there's not a lot of movement in. There's some movement out, but it's not as transient as a lot of other areas. What is it about the people of northern Pennsylvania that brought this with them or promulgated these stories?
Sure, and to give a slightly broader context for anybody who didn't hear the first one, Pennsylvania was kind of at the crossroads of America early on. We tend not to consider the importance of Pennsylvania now, because it's kind of diminished compared to some other states, but it was possibly the most important state in the early republic and in the early years of the colonies, and it also had the very open religious tolerance policy of William Penn, at least relative religious tolerance. Lots of different groups came here with varying beliefs. And, it was a safe haven for people. You had German pietists, you had Moravians, you had weird, what today would be almost considered cults, like the Hermits of Wissahickon. But
in fact, I had run for mayor of one of those towns some years ago, Harmony, which was, yes. In fact, I always say, every time I bring up the Harmonists, I always say, if you read Lord Byron's Don Juan, In
Yeah.
the fifth canto, he mentions the Harmonists of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Really interesting. Another one of those mini utopian societies.
Yes, yeah, and so this was just a good place, and Pennsylvania, and something I don't even know if I mentioned it last time. Pennsylvania was one of the from a purely socioeconomic standpoint, which impacts folklore. Pennsylvania was probably the closest we ever got to like a true middle class utopia in the 1800s, right? Pennsylvania had probably the largest middle class of any states. It had the biggest group in the middle. It was the closest to kind of Jefferson's ideas of the kind of the noble small farmers, the kind of the state made up of the noble farmers. We tend to think of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia as Pennsylvania, but most of Pennsylvania was small farms, and much of it still is. And it's wildlands, and there's all the space in between those cities.
Yeah, I know I often surprise people to know that the northern tier of Pennsylvania, of which we'll be talking about a lot today, wasn't even fully mapped out until the 1920s, which is wild to consider.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of those big areas, that's why up north you have the only real old growth forests as well. Everything else got cut. In fact, that plays into a few stories.
Well, the whole brush heap era. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you had, those areas that remained. But one thing, that Pennsylvania tracked, there was lots of German settlers and lots of French settlers. We tend not to think lots of French people in Pennsylvania, but there were pockets, There were places like Frenchville and, places like that where you had French or mixed blood French settlers.
Well, and of course, the area out west here, part of Nouveau France, at that
Yes.
one point, of course, Fort Le Boeuf, Fort Duquesne. But when you said about the middle class, I was really interested in that. And I'm kind of curious because I think, too, of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And part of what makes me feel that way, without any evidence backing up the statement, is because there were a lot of merchant class people, as well as a lot of the very blue collar, but relatively speaking, paid fairly well shipping industry. I'm curious because when you say French, I think a lot about it being ancestrally Huguenot. A lot of those were merchants and skilled tradesmen.
Yeah.
Other than some of the more tolerant aspects of William Penn that kind of got the province of Pennsylvania rolling, what are some of the factors that you see that led to this? Was it just the location and just I'm curious.
Yeah, it was, there are a variety of factors. Pennsylvania had the weird, because of the toleration, you had lots of Germans come in Germans, at that time, the ones that came here, and as you mentioned, the French that did come here, especially the Protestants fleeing during some various things. You had, a lot of them were skilled craftsmen, but you had, the Germans had that German work ethic, which is a real thing. That's not like an exaggeration. That's the very industrious Germans. They were known as that. It's kind of a stereotype, but it's also true. If you look at businesses, middle class, but then you also have a lot of rugged kind of middle level farmers, right? In Pennsylvania, you can't have big farming. In the southern colonies, you could have big mega plantations and big farms. Even the small big farms were big farms. And then you had, of course, then very poor people in Appalachia and other places, and a lot of there was more class range in like South Carolina than there was in Pennsylvania. And not that there wasn't there wasn't rich people and poor people, but a larger bulk was in the middle. And there was a little more opportunity in a variety of ways. And there were more things you could get into. There were more industries to expand into. So it attracted this kind of broad middle class. But again, a lot of it was agriculture based. And we tend not to think of that, especially in places like Pittsburgh, where it's industry. We think of industry building. And that was there too, but you had a lot of Pennsylvania was farms and agriculture, and you almost always, agriculture and werewolf stories go hand in hand. And at least traditionally in history, right? It's always in agricultural societies, and it's a recurring thing. Just because that was the nature of society, but all of this stuff and some of the tangents are also tied to agriculture as well.
Well, agriculture, and when you say industry, a lot of the earliest industry in the Commonwealth that I'm aware of There was tanneries. There
Yes.
was obviously the woods. All the little iron. Of course, our whole thing is the ghost. It's the old iron
Yes.
furnaces that
Yeah.
you see.
Right, right.
So early iron tanneries, wood. I'm trying to remember the thing that they would burn the wood for and then sell that. But all these early industries are also natural. They're like you're
Yes.
in the
Yes.
woods or on the cusp of it.
And even
You're
if you
outside.
even if you couldn't, even if you didn't weren't able to run a farm, you weren't able to do a variety of other things. There were a lot of early on in Pennsylvania, there were a lot of people that were just professional hunters. There was so much game here that you could shoot 250 animals a year and sell them.
Yeah. We've
Market
talked
hunting,
about Philip.
trapping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. We've
And
talked about
Nussmuck,
Philip
yeah.
Tome
Mhm.
yes. Yeah.
in his 30 Years a Hunter. Again, another questionable book because it's the earliest reference I know of hoop snakes.
Yeah.
But right. Okay. So yeah. So even the industry that was, I'm not aware, at least in the central and once you get beyond the Susquehanna, of a lot of textiles or anything that's more of an indoor thing, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a lot of it's farms, a lot of it, kind of it plays out in that way. And that's the other thing it's interesting too. Pennsylvania's population is stable. Those small farms tend to be the kind that get passed on, right? They
Right.
tend to get passed on. They're not
Legacies.
gobbled up. It's not one family. It's a community of families that are relatively stable over time. And Pennsylvania, there's something about the place where people, it's kind of like a pool, right? And even people that leave, and I used this example last time, if you go to like Arizona, you'll find a Pittsburgh bar, but you're never going to find a Phoenix bar in Pittsburgh,
Right. Right.
in fact, you're not going to find any other city's bar in Pittsburgh. You don't find a Rome bar or a London bar in Pittsburgh. They just don't exist. But you go to London or Rome, there's a Pittsburgh bar.
Yeah, I actually had a cousin who wrote a book on Pittsburgh bars around the
Yeah.
country and the world. So that's a really good point. So like that obviously has to affect the folklore because you
Yes.
have people staying put in a lot of cases, but also leaving, gathering whatever stories, cultural experiences, and then coming back. So how does that affect the folklore? Is it just because it's a little bit of a melting pot, or does that actually make things harder for folks in your kind of position to track these things?
Well, in many ways, actually, a lot of the folklore in Pennsylvania, when they mapped it out in the 70s, they kind of traced most folk traditions. Now, this doesn't include stuff that stayed in the Gulf of Mexico and never spread out across the country, or stuff that was in California, either from Chinese immigrants, Russians, or Hispanic folklore that went in the Southwest. Almost every other form of folklore funneled into Pennsylvania when they tracked it. It funneled in, came to a point in Pittsburgh, traveled down the river, and spread back out across the country.
Wow.
And so
Okay.
most
Yeah.
folk traditions exist in Pennsylvania in some way, and many of them at least pass through very early on. So there's this exposure to a whole variety of traditions. And then as people leave and come back, they bring new stuff. And then, of course, this stability of population lets people be able to pass a story on for 3 or 4 generations. And then, now, we've reached the point where there's the internet and all these books, and there's a lot of people that write books on folklore, or at least try to, like books, even if they're just collecting ghost stories
Right.
at face value, they're recording a story, so it
Right.
is,
Right. Right.
I was going to say, don't dismiss yourself because I've been.
but you record the stories, and there's and then some people apply analysis, some don't, but either way, it's saving the story. It gets passed on. And then, with every generation, there might be tweaks or changes, but some core elements always remain. And that kind of lets it flourish here. And even
that was one of the things we talked about in our last conversation is how even in our time, we've seen stories evolve. I know we talked about the Blue Mist Road, and you brought up stories of Blue Mist that existed that we didn't know, because there's almost not one. There's like 5 different stories that are all known by the same name in the same location, but they're wildly different from one another, and they're affected not only by the people who are there at the time, but the media experiences. I believe we had discussion about that.
Yeah, and all the social pressures and everything, and they make legends adapt. But even these werewolf legends, they are a result of a certain amount of social pressures, whether you believe in werewolves or not. Don't worry. By the end of this podcast, I will tell you how to defend yourself against werewolves in Pennsylvania.
That was my next question.
But you got to stay tuned till the end.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be, you have to
Still want to
stay
bury the
tuned.
lead.
Because there is actually folklore on that. So.
Could you share with us maybe a bit of one of these stories? I don't know if there's anyone that really jumps to you, or if there's maybe a particularly early example that sets an archetype.
Yeah, there is. Well, there's a couple different batches of stories, but one of my favorites, and it's kind of a classic. I like it because I can envision it happening in my mind, and it happened in. It was told to the Quigley family by a hunter, a famous Pennsylvania hunter named Peter Pence, and the Quigley family was in. I believe they were in Clinton County. And Peter Pence in the early, like maybe 1840, it's not a specific date, but it's implied like maybe 1840s or so. His aunt, Devert Mary Poe, was a midwife. And one night late, she was out at a neighboring farm helping to deliver twins, which was, a very difficult delivery back then. And she was there till like 3 a.m. It had been all day into the night. The baby survived. Mother was okay. She's walking home. It's the middle of the night. Her husband was kind of asleep in the chair in the living room waiting for her to get back. But as she's walking back and she sees her house on the horizon, her farmyard, and I mean, it was a big, she had hundreds of acres, I don't know, hundreds of acres, but a lot of land. And she was walking up towards the fence. She notices in the moonlight what looks like a large black dog in the distance, but it's kind of coming on at first it's walking parallel, but then it turns on a path that's going to intercept her if it keeps moving in that direction. And so she picks up her pace a little bit, and the thing continues to move towards her. And as it gets closer, she realizes it's very large. It's not just a regular dog or even a regular wolf. It's black, has black fur. And as it picks up the pace and gets closer, she's getting very nervous. She starts to run a little bit to get to her gate. She notices it starts to get up on its back 2 legs and just move on its back 2 legs and lunge towards her. So she runs through the gate, doesn't shut the gate. It follows her into the yard, chasing her. She flies it as fast as she can up to her cabin door, pushes the door open, dives inside, slams it shut, throws her weight against it, and locks it. And it wakes her husband up, the noise. And he gets up and she tells him what happened. And he peeks out and he can see something moving around out there in the darkness. So he goes to the mantle and he has 2 bullets there sitting on the mantle above the fireplace. And they're wrapped in sacramental wax, which I'll explain in a minute. And he loads them into his gun. And he walks out into the yard, even though his wife's telling him, don't go out there. He opens the door and he walks out and he sees it still pacing, the wolf-like beast. He raises his gun and takes aim in the moonlight and he fires. And he strikes it and it goes down. And so he advances closer with the second bullet ready to take another shot. And as he gets there, he's startled because what was clearly a wolf to him a few minutes ago, he walks up to and he sees it slowly becoming his neighbor on the ground. And the neighbor's dying, and he thanks him for releasing him and dies there in the yard. And so it's kind of a classic werewolf story, or either a great cover-up for killing your neighbor. I don't know which. But but there's some elements in there that, first of all, the fact that he had bullets ready to do this tells you something.
Right. This was a common occurrence enough.
Yeah, the people were prepared. And blessed bullets, there's always the thing about silver bullets with werewolves. Mm-hmm. Silver bullets were originally used to kill witches. And I'm going to talk about the relationship with witches and werewolves in a few minutes. I'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Right.
But there's an overlap there. People just look at modern movies and they think werewolves are this thing, or witches are this thing. In the past, they were overlapping.
Right.
People thought witches could turn into wolves too. And so, they would have these ready, but it didn't necessarily have to be a silver bullet. It could be blessed. In Pennsylvania, you had Pennsylvania German folk magic. They call powwow, or you hear
the Braukers,
yeah, Braukers, yeah. And so you'd have these people that would make these kind of charmed bullets. And there was a whole set of magic for dealing with thieves and hunting and everything. So you make these bullets for protection, and then if a magically charmed animal came after you, whether it be a werewolf or something else, you could use this to hit it. whether it be a witch in a human form or animal form,
Right.
And so people would have these lying around just for such occasions. And so, that isn't weird. He turns back and, he was out there, and the fact that the husband doesn't even really question his wife is that, like
Right.
imagine, somebody running in, a friend or something is saying, there's a werewolf outside, just chased me to the door. You'd be like, what are you talking about? But he just says, okay, he gets the bullets and goes out there and goes after it.
Right. So like you said, I think that speaks volumes to the amount of like kind of cultural or tribal knowledge that the person has in this story. So, and you mentioned also how nowadays we think of these things being all very siloed and different. We have kind of like our modern version of like the lore.
Yes.
What would someone in this person's experience, like what would their lore have been at the time compared to what we have now?
Yeah, so let me back up, and I'll back up like kind of a really short history of werewolf lore, how it actually unfolded, as opposed to what many people think. So, first of all, werewolves and about monsters in general. Monsters function a lot like ghosts or whatever in society, right? Monsters always reflect at the time what people were afraid of. Like modern monsters, people like aliens, right? But nobody was afraid of aliens till after World War II. And nuclear bombs and jets in the air and death from above, and then suddenly, what if there's something so powerful that can just wipe us out from above, we can't stop it? Right. Or in early modern times in the Middle Ages, a wolf, a man that was half wolf, half man, was an affront to God. It was like a mockery of humans. So it was monstrous. But monsters change in different environments depending on what people are afraid of. And so that's really how werewolves developed. But early on, even in old societies, they always talk about Viking berserkers, right? And it's important to note that many of the people that believed, even the people that believed in kind of the traditional werewolves, didn't always believe that a person literally changed into a wolf. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they thought they changed into a wolf. Sometimes they thought, in the Middle Ages, the devil made a copy of them that was a wolf. They were lying catatonic somewhere. Or there was something else in between, or an illusion of a wolf or something.
Or like, wasn't one like a belt or something?
Yes, in fact, that was one of the ways that relates to witchcraft. During the times of the witch trials, there was this idea that you became a werewolf. It wasn't from being bitten; you voluntarily became a werewolf. So you'd put on a wolfskin belt and you'd rub an ointment or a salve or something on you that had probably hallucinogenic properties, much like ancient berserkers would.
I was going to say, just like berserkers.
In fact, werewolf might come from the old Saxon term werewolf, which would be another term for berserkers.
Oh, that's just cool too. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what some people say anyway. I mean, they're not sure,
Right.
But, the English, version of it. So, and berserkers just went nuts after they rubbed probably hallucinogenic stuff on them. Basically, they got high on drugs and went on a massacre, a killing spree till it wore off. And so, but you evolve, like where the term lycanthropy comes from, King Lycon from ancient mythology, Greek or Roman, offends Zeus and he turns him into a werewolf essentially. Mm-hmm. And that's where we get the term. But lycanthropy can mean, in a clinical sense, you believe you turn into a wolf, or it can mean in a folklore sense, somebody that actually
there's kind of a dual. Yeah, there's duality there. Yeah,
but there were like werewolf trials in the 14 and 1500s at the same time as witch trials. Just weren't as many of them, and it was kind of inverted. And a lot of people pay no attention to them, which always amazes me because there's so many books written about the witch trials. Or often they'll get thrown in a little bit with them, but often it was very young. The witch trials was and there's a lot of misinformation. The witch trials are one of the most misinformed. People are most misinformed about that as a historical topic. There's a lot of bad information about that. Mm-hmm.
I listened to an entire lecture series about, and some of the things that surprised me is learning that no one in America was burned at the stake. This is something like somehow that got translated to America. And even just the number of men that were
about a quarter of all the witches were men, and it was reversed for the werewolf trials. 3/4 of them were men and 1/4 women, whereas the witches were 3/4 men, 1/4 women in Europe. In America, it was always about 50-50. And yeah, even in Europe, hardly anybody was burned by the witch, burned as a witch, right? Most people were executed, and everybody was executed by the state. That's another misnomer, right? And the werewolf and witch stuff comes at a time in Europe after the Renaissance and the Reformation. Then you have the war of religion, where all the old stability is breaking down.
Right.
So suddenly,
Right.
both sides now have to define their theology very clearly. So now you have very precise definitions of what the devil is and what the devil can do from both Catholic and Protestant perspectives. And so now, like, it becomes very, you don't have werewolf cases from like 1200. They're all in the early modern or Renaissance era for the most part. And, or witch trials too. There's a handful, but only a few. So what happens is that they became kind of an example almost of heresy during those times. And so, both the witches and the werewolves were kind of like it was kind of like the satanic panic. Like, what's the worst thing we can imagine at this moment? And it was a similar type thing. And, and every witch trial was different, contrary to popular belief, and often, it was all local politics for the most part, many of those trials. But same with the werewolf trials. Although some of those werewolf trials, some of those people might have been early serial killers. Peter Stubb and people like that in Germany, that they found them ripping a body apart, and they may have been they didn't have serial a category for serial killers back then.
Right.
Well, and I think of the happenings in southern France around them, which are oftentimes cited as like an early werewolf stories. And when people say like, oh, Jack the Ripper or whomever is the first serial killer, I call BS, only because people have been people for a long time. So, like, I don't buy that.
Yeah, people are the same since 5000 BC or more,
Right. And the more we learn, it seems like more yet. But yeah, it is surprising, though, I think, because we're having to occupy two really competing ideas of the era. What we think is the Renaissance and kind of the middle to the late Renaissance, it coincides with what people have coined the burning times. And those are two very different ideas, you would think. But again, moral panics like the Satanic Panic, which you've brought up again, the 80s and the 1990s. And you wouldn't think that would be a really puritanical age, but there was definitely a backlash that was. And I'll let you go on. I'm sorry.
No, I was just about to say, so what we're saying then is someone having a silver or a sacramental bullet and sacramental wax, as you said, on their mantle at this time in 1840, that wouldn't have been a strange thing in north central Pennsylvania.
No, not at all. In fact, in a lot of Europe or the world, it wouldn't have been weird. The thing is too, the other thing I want to mention about werewolves is not only do werewolves represent, they kind of emerged during that upheaval in society, but then continue. And one of the reasons they continue is what most people forget is the massive depopulation of Europe during those times. First with the Black Death, where anywhere between a third and a half die in any area. Then when you get to the wars religion, like the 30 Years' War, 50% of the German population probably died in that war. And people don't realize that today. I mean, that's a staggering number. And what happens is, entire towns and villages would be damaged or abandoned. And so nature started to creep back in. And then with that came wolves. And the wolf population spiked in Europe. So there were actually real wolves that were a danger during this time. It was, to flocks, to children, so there were real wolves. And by the time you get to Pennsylvania in the 1800s, there's real wolves. They're not gone yet. And they're a danger. So there's a real danger about wolves. And then there's the belief in the supernatural layered on top of it. And it creates this kind of perfect storm. I always tell people, only in the past century and a half, maybe even the past century and a half, has the majority of the population not believed in magic.
Right. For a small, it's a small window we're actually looking at.
I don't know. I think it may be magic in the way that we think about it, but when I hear radio ads and see some TV ads or internet ads, I mean, there's still people that believe in magic out there. It's just,
there's still a lot. There's still
potions and whatnot.
It's not the majority anymore, at least that would admit to it, right? There's a lot of
Right.
That I
That's the
believe.
key, I think.
yeah, they would
Yep.
admit to it. I still think the belief is still there. I mean, 50, more than 50%. Well, it's like when if you have to give your name in the survey, when they ask people if they believe in ghosts, it's like 50%. If you
Right.
don't have to give your name, it jumps to like 70%.
It's
So
telling. Yep.
it's people just don't want to admit that they believe it, and
Or and then even how you devise it, because I mean, if you ask me and you're asking a yes or no,
yeah,
I'm not able to say yes or no to most anything. So I probably have to go
exactly.
yes just because I have that tiny sliver of
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, so it's this whole range. So, in the 1800s, most people you would encounter belief in some type of folk magic. What not like big, like Disney magic or lightning
But
bolts, but
practical,
like,
like,
yeah,
yeah.
practical affecting your daily life, charms, small incantations, spells, things that would help you out in your daily life, especially in an agricultural society where you have no control a lot of the time. We're so used to having so much control of our life that people get really, like when the phones went out the other day, yesterday or whatever,
Right.
panic. If you have a farm, you're nature's the mercy of nature, and that having the ability to try to use anything you can to change that or adapt that makes you feel more comfortable. And that includes fighting off predators, whether they be real or magical or something supernatural. And that's where a lot of these, the werewolf stories are these threats from these supernatural predators. And in fact, there's a couple more good stories from Clinton County that illustrate this, and I'll give you a few. A couple came from the Quigley family, which actually ended up having several experiences with werewolves.
I'm
Um,
starting to become suspicious of this
yeah,
family.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's they had it was two branches, but they had about quite a few. But so the one branch, and I believe it was let me look here. There's so many of them I forgot the name. So it's George Quigley having his horses like he'd what they call they'd be lathered up in the morning, basically like they had been working all night, right? Like they had been terrified or they hadn't gotten good rest. So
Right.
every night or every morning he'd come out and his horses like didn't want to work and they were tired and worn out. And something was going on. He'd hear them out there in the barn. He'd go out to look, but he didn't see anything. So finally, he decides that he's going to stake out the barn all night. And he had seen this wolf hanging around, this female wolf, like big. It was a large one with like dark brown fur hanging around nearby. And he was starting to suspect that the wolf might have something with scaring the horses. So one night he hangs out outside his barn and he waits and he loads his gun. And of course, he has a silver bullet just in case, because why not? It still works. And he basically waits and waits. And then suddenly around midnight, that wolf comes running and jumps into his barn, through one of those half doors. And he's not quick enough to shoot it on the way in. That's usually what happens in these stories. You don't get it at first, but it's in there aggravating them. And eventually near dawn, it leaves and it jumps out and he fires and he hits it. And it hits in the front leg. And so it runs off. And, the next night or so, it doesn't come back after it's been hit. But what he finds out, though, is the next day that a woman that lives not that far away, who wasn't really a big fan of his, showed up at one of the neighbors suddenly with a broken arm. She had fallen and broken her front arm, the same, what would be the equivalent limb that he shot on the wolf. And after he did that, she never came back. And that's kind of an example of how these stories overlap with witchcraft, right? Because we tend to think of werewolves. Like if a werewolf jumped into a barn, it would just tear everything apart, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this wolf just harassed these horses to make the farmer's life miserable, essentially. And that's what people often thought witches did, that supernaturally harass people. So the wolf jumps out and he manages to shoot it, and it turns out to be a female. It is a female, and witch or werewolf, which is it? You know what I mean? It could be either. It could fall in either category. Some people thought witches could turn into wolves.
And I've heard this about vampires too, but I don't know how much of that is like the Stoker influence.
Yeah, that kind of depends on where and when you hear the legend with vampires. Luckily, Pennsylvania only has one vampire story I'm aware of, but it's still a good one. But but yeah, there's this idea, that the evil things turn into wolves because wolves were apex predators, essentially.
Right. Right.
And so they were something threatening. And there's other tales. In fact, there's another tale where another branch, Philip Quigley, him and his wife, their horses were all similar thing would happen to them. Horses were basically useless. He couldn't use them on the farm, 3 of them, so he was going to sell them. And his wife said, "Let me wait and see." And a very similar story. She waits outside. At night, this black wolf jumps in, and she can't get it right away, so she goes in and gets the gun, loads it with it might be a Sacramento wax bullet, either silver or Sacramento wax. Sometimes they do it both. They put the Sacramento wax on the silver bullet just for extra protection.
I was going to say, you can never be too safe.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So anyway, she catches it when it comes out. She fires, shoots it in the jaw. Again, similar thing. A couple days later, they found out this woman who didn't like them in town came into a friend's with a broken jaw. She had to have set, and there was no good excuses why her jaw was broken, and she had it set. Now, maybe it just was a coincidence, but so that family had multiple things. There was another family from I don't know if they were I can't remember if they were in Clinton or Center County. It had a similar thing as well, where the wolves were jumping in to harass their livestock. And this time, this one woman watched them, and it was 3 big black wolves jumped in together. They could also talk. She could hear them talk. And she was watching them, and suddenly her horses start jumping out of the barn, each one with a wolf on its back, literally like riding on top of, and the wolves drove the horses all around, pushing them all over the place in the neighborhood for miles, and brought them back before dawn. And then the wolves took off. So what she did was she had seen them go in the direction, and she found some burrs and some things from this one of the plants she knew grew on this mountain called Fallsbrook Mountain. And Fallsbrook Mountain was known as a witch's mountain. It was one of those mountains where witches supposedly gathered on Walpurgis Night and Halloween to make their pacts with the devil. There's a few of those in Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
That could be a whole separate episode.
Right.
There's 3 or 4 of those. But there's so she went up there, and there were big thorn bushes on the mountain, as often are said to grow on these mountains. So she picked all these really big, like 2-inch long thorns, dozens of them, brought them down, and she took saddle blankets and put the thorns through the saddle blankets, but you couldn't really see them in the dark. She put those saddle blankets on the backs of the horses, so the thorns were all sticking up. So the next night, the wolves come in to do the same thing. All of a sudden, they all shriek and go darting out with all of these thorns stuck all over them. So they jumped on them with their bellies down, so they had thorns stuck through them. They take off. And she finds out that somebody in the town was having thorns removed. They had hundreds of thorns stuck in them that she hears a rumor a day or 2 later. The thing is, much like witchcraft, once you do that to them, they leave you alone.
Right.
Once you flip it on them, or once they know, it's done.
Well, I'm interested. And by the way, I'm aware of a Falls Brook that's in Tioga County. I don't know if that might be the same. That is Northern Tier.
Yeah, that could be the same mountain. Fallsbrook was the German name for it that was recorded back in the 1800s. So that's probably there's a good chance that's it. Yeah, I can't off the top of my head remember what exact mountain it was.
One of the things I'd be curious is if there's anything more to this story, because I'm wondering, is this a cadre of witches, or because if it's the typical werewolf story that werewolf lore that most people are familiar with today, they wouldn't be collaborating in this way, because it seems like the typical werewolf in London sort of story, they're not even aware of it until they start putting the pieces together. The other thing I suspected, could this be like a family, like, the father and a couple, and they're harassing another family that they're kind of competing with in some manner. That's I've heard of mischievous spirits, devils, and everything doing similar things with horses. The devil himself in some stories.
Yes, yeah.
Never heard of werewolves and collaborating.
Yeah. Collaborating werewolves, and the part that really got me in that one was them speaking. like
Yeah.
like people. And that just reminds me of like, like the wolves and Princess Mononoke and the wolves. I mean, even Black Phillip and the witch and everything. That's
Yeah.
just so like, because that then, to me, what that does is it kind of takes it from someone transforming into a werewolf or wolf and it being like such a physical thing, like, the bones popping and someone really changing, like kind of in the first story where someone was physically transforming. That seems more, that from to me feels more supernatural and is
Yeah.
almost scarier because, like, does the sacramental wax and silver bullet work now? Because this is something that
Yeah.
is so out of the usual, even for these people.
Well,
Yeah.
and I see it as being like the difference between you're afflicted with something and a deliberate thing.
Yes.
Yes.
And yeah, kind of like the witches you said. A lot of witch stories, they can transform into different animals, and of course there's that sort of thing with the vampires. So I didn't mean to get into vampires, but
Yeah.
there
Oh,
does
no,
seem to
that's
be
fine.
some similarities
Well, there is
in
that
that
overlap,
aspect.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's that's the thing with some of these witch stories too. Is like there's definitely, I mean, Pennsylvania has so many witchcraft cases that people are unaware of that that never went to a trial because they didn't put them on trial here, so they turned to folk magic to fight folk magic. In fact, one of the stories I'll tell you in a minute, they use folk magic to catch a werewolf. Um,
Well, and I think, of course, of the long lost friend, and there's so much in
yeah,
there. Like, if you've been hexed,
yeah,
and that's folk magic with folk magic.
yeah. And so, but another story I want to mention that is a more traditional one. That's probably the most famous Pennsylvania werewolf story, and it happened out in Northampton County, which is well known for folk magic and hex. And there was this young girl who was a shepherdess in her family. She was taking care of the sheep at like age 13, 14, and her name was May Paul. And there was this old guy in the community that it was a little creepy to to everyone, but he would sit on a log and just watch her as she was taking care of the sheep, right? Like today, you'd probably be like, "Who's that creepy old guy? Is this a child
Right.
predator or something?"
Right.
And at the time, there were these wolf attacks tearing the flocks apart, and somehow Maypaw's flock was never hurt. They never lost a single sheep. So her parents, even though the guy was creepy, for some reason, whenever he was around, the sheep were fine. So as long as he wasn't doing anything, too bad. So he would talk to
Right.
her and stuff, and he would hang out and spend the day there. But they kind of ignored it. And he was older. It wasn't like he was just like in his 20s. And because back then, a 25 or 26-year-old marrying like a 15-year-old wasn't weird. It's weird today, but it wasn't that weird back then. But he was much older. And so finally, this killing had gone on. Their flock was unaffected for months and months. Um, and finally, one of these desperate shepherds was out, one night with his gun, and he's looking for these wolves that are tearing the sheep apart. And across the road crosses this giant, big old wolf, and he sees it in the moonlight, and it doesn't see him right away. So he takes a shot and fires and hits it. And he hits it, he hears it yelp, and it takes off. But it's too dark to follow, and he figures it's not safe. So he comes back in the morning because there was a $25 bounty on the wolves, which is a lot of money back then. But that's how bad it was at the time.
Right.
That's like giving somebody $1,000 today for
That pays for a lot of additional silver
yeah,
bullets at that
yeah,
time.
exactly.
Seriously.
And so he follows him back, and the blood. He's taking the blood trail. He's going, expecting to go into the woods, but he goes into the farms, and it leads right up to the door of that old man who watches Maypaw. And the door's open, and inside he's laying on the ground with a gunshot wound, dead. And so people then in the community speculated that he was the werewolf, and because he liked this Maypaw, her flock was spared. Interesting thing is it turned into a ghost story, though, because Maypaw continued to see him for years after, sitting on the log watching her after he was dead. And actually, interestingly enough, I recently learned that Maypaw eventually, it's hard to get information on these old stories, but I found out that Maypaw, when she finally got married later on, eventually somehow, I think her son moved to Clarion, and eventually she moved to Clarion, and she's buried somewhere out in Clarion. Whereas in Northampton, you have the famous, they call it the Wolfman's Grave, was the site
Right.
of the guy, you know,
Right.
and that's where he was buried. But that's probably the most well known, you know, kind of traditional style werewolf story.
Well, and there's a few thoughts I have, and I'll be brief with them. It seems like either this man is, like, hey, Aqualung, or this is more of a protector sort of thing, because not only did it protect the flock, but was the ghost there watching is like a protecting spirit? Was it really just a licentious old man whose perversions won't be denied even beyond the grave? But one of the things that Brendan turned me on to some years ago was the idea of the hide behind, which I believe has Lenape origins.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
In which, just for those who aren't familiar, when a party would go out into the woods, they would pick the person that kind of needed bolstering and put them in the back, and there was strict orders that they could not look behind them or they would be taken by this creature. One of the things that several of these stories that you shared with us this evening is that if you stand up to it, it doesn't come back to pester your livestock, give you a hard time. I wonder if part of this is like that psychological need, like some of these stories were created and or promoted to give people that sort of, you have to, even if you're not confident, you have to do what needs to be done to protect, because if you don't, it's going to continue to cause havoc. I don't know if you have any thoughts to that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, because most folklore like this does serve some kind of function. You know, we've kind of lost the specific context in the way these stories were originally told at the time. So, but a lot of folklore today does make you, it encourages you to take action one way or another. You know, some of it's just for fun, some of it's supernatural, but some of it's defensive or protective action. And, even if, often you see this a lot today in conspiracy theories too, whereas groups have conspiracy theories to warn you to take action to prevent your group from being wiped out or destroyed by government or whatever force you perceive is coming after you. And there's been just enough true conspiracies to make it seem, but you feel like you have to take action. That's why you have people that tend to, on occasion, do extreme things in this attempt, in their mind, preventing. They're often portrayed as these like kind of psychotic people, but in reality, they live in a reality in their mind where they're taking appropriate action. But to everyone else, it's not appropriate action. But even a lot of people just prepare for things. That they're afraid of that's going to come. But preparation also makes you feel more confident, as you say. Like you're not afraid once you do things a few times and you know how it's going to go.
Maybe these stories were generated by big silver bullet.
Yeah.
No, but the utility, but like the utility comes from the context. Like you said, we don't really have the context of how these were told or the reason why they were told a lot of times.
And specifically,
just fireside tales.
Yeah, exactly. Who told them the first time is often the most important part. Were these told by parents to young people? Was it young people among themselves? Was it just people in the community among themselves? Was it drunk guys at a bar? And you don't know. So yeah, sometimes the context is also important, but the same story can be told in different contexts and mean different things too. So, it does exist in this world where witchcraft and this stuff was real. So, werewolves could be real. And even though a lot of people, with witchcraft and werewolves, they're pretty sure it's not real, but they're not 100%. And so a lot of these people would say, no, I don't believe in that. But when you're walking down that road at night in the dark, in like the real dark Pennsylvania woods, and there's a sliver of a moon, something's following you, you're pretty sure something's there. Are you going to take the chance that, are you going to, so.
Yeah.
Listen, I bought the blessed wax just in the hopes that I would never have to use them.
Yeah.
Well, anybody who's walked through, I mean, really anywhere, but I think everyone can relate to the idea of walking through, somewhere late at night, full moon or something like that, and you're just like, you just like,
Yeah.
and you hear those stories, and if thinking, okay, I do have some control, which
Yeah.
is I think what a lot of these come down to, is it's a control issue. Um, you can understand why people would err on the side of that caution. And I think you're right that a lot of it does really sound like stuff that has to do with witchcraft and hex and everything, like we mentioned. Are there any other things that are different between the werewolf lore that may have come over with all these things that separates it from witchcraft, or is that Venn diagram more the same than different?
It's, in many ways it's the same. And if you look at like actual werewolf folklore in Europe, it's more the same. But there are different, like by the time you get to things like there are kind of the classic werewolf stories, uh, you know, where the wolf functions separately. I mean, the most famous, I think, is probably the most interesting werewolf story ever told is the Beast of Gévaudan in France, where it killed over 100 people. Something was
Yeah.
killing over 100
Yeah.
people.
That's the one I was referencing earlier
Yeah.
about southern
Yeah.
France, but I could not remember the name.
And that was, that was, they thought they killed one wolf and they took it away, a professional hunter, but the killings kept going. And it was literally only stopped by the last killing of the big wolf with a guy with a silver bullet. And that literally is what the last shot was. And that ended it.
It's the 18th century version of Jaws, really,
Yes,
where they
yeah.
get the red
Right,
herring.
right.
Yeah. And,
No, but it's a really wild story, though, and it's one of the ones that when you were talking about serial killers earlier, I had always suspected because I've heard people talk about it, or I've read stories about it, and they talk about, well, the person was disemboweled or the person was decapitated, and that was a frequent thing, if I'm not mistaken. And they were saying clearly this was some big animal, and I thought, well, clearly this could have just been a terrible person as well.
yeah.
But they definitely seem to, by all evidence that exists to this day, have stopped with the killing of that second wolf. And as I recall, the second, both wolves, there wasn't anything particularly preternatural about either. And I think the second one was a bit large, and I know I've seen statues of it that are around.
And I've often wondered, I don't know if you're familiar with the stories of the Lions of Savo.
I was just about to say, Ghost in the Darkness. Yep.
Yeah, I actually have the book here on my shelf here,
wild.
which it's quite a read, honestly.
Yeah, I have it. It's right up there on my shelf too. And that's a fascinating story. And now they think that the one of them had a bad tooth. Now they can't explain why the other one went along with them, but they hunted as a pair, and one had a bad tooth, so he couldn't bring down normal prey. They went after people, and they killed about 125, 130 people too.
Same.
It's a weirdly kind of parallel thing, and I often wonder if there wasn't a couple wolves there in a pack that couldn't hunt normally, and they were picking off like women picking berries and children out, because a lot of them were like they weren't necessarily killing a lot of men; they were killing like women and children, a lot of them. And I wonder if that wasn't a similar situation there as well.
Yeah, because I mean, the man-eaters of Savo, if a toothache is enough, I mean that's an example. But if something like that would be enough for a couple of lions or even a single lion, because of course one of the things is that it seems that most cultures have some sort of shifting from human into animal or quasi-animal. Like I've heard of jaguars in South American cultures. I've heard of in the India, Pakistan, where there are people that shift into monkeys, which doesn't seem like that far a drive. But it seems like if that happened at Savo, certainly that's happened in other places at other times with other apex predators like wolves.
So like we have the influence coming from, folks over in especially Germany, like you mentioned, that had the wild re-encroaching on their cities. And then you have those folks coming over here culturally and doing the opposite, where they're kind of taking back the wild that's fresh to them here, and seeing a similar, predator. Do we have historical evidence of wolves killing that many people at this time? or is that more of a perception? Because
It's more of a perception. It's
okay,
usually they would kill animals like livestock,
right,
which would
hmm
be very financially damaging
for
or
sure.
difficult. But yeah, it's kind of like shark attacks. People think sharks are super dangerous, but you're more likely to be bitten by a human from New York than by a shark,
Ugh, yeah,
statistically. So,
Well, and a
it's
shark
like
is more likely to be killed by a person than a person is to be
exactly.
killed by a shark, even.
Yeah.
right, right,
So,
right.
a lot of things, aren't really statistically viable. And the shark doesn't even want to eat you. It bites and lets go. Um, whereas, yeah, it's one of those things where the wolves are perceived as dangerous, but people do this with a lot of animals. Like many animals people are afraid of are completely,
Right.
basically harmless.
Well, Brendan and I have talked about black bears to
Yeah.
people we encounter quite a bit. I mean, Brendan
hmm
had one
One
real
bad.
rough episode with a black bear
Yeah.
he tussled with, but I've always compared the black bears that live in our forests to kind of like big dogs. Like your terrier will chase after a black bear, and that black bear will run. And this kind of actually brings me to something you talked about having control and how having that control can mean a lot. And I've oftentimes thought about sometimes Brendan and I will be way out there fishing, fly fishing on some of the streams, and I thought about having a handgun. Again,
Yeah.
this is probably because I'm an idiot in my head,
Right.
but there have been some times where it's like I don't want to use it, I don't want to have it,
hmm
but it would give me that like sense that something happened, and that takes me to
Right.
kind of I want to throw this by you both because I'm always interested in we look so much at where the stories were and how, but where are they going? And I don't know how familiar you are with the coyotes that we now have. The
Yes.
coyotes that we have are not native coyotes, and we've seen them hunting, which
Yeah.
is not like a common thing for coyotes to do. I'm kind of curious if these stories will evolve, not maybe into someone shifting into a coyote, but of coyotes of unusual cunning or of extraordinary size. And I wonder if they will be another link in these sort of chains. I throw it to the two of you to respond with you. What are your thoughts to that? Or do you see these stories still being around but evolving in another direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think coyotes definitely, because I've seen a lot about them lately. I know I don't live far from a place that used to be called Highland Country Club, and it was torn down. And I live in Westview, and it's up there, and it's not that far away, and it was torn down, made into how various houses of
There
different.
was a
One
giant
big,
eagle there,
yeah,
and I
yeah,
still have my wife and I, when we first moved back to this area, we lived on the other side of 79
yeah,
in Bellevue area. And
yeah, yeah.
I
It's
knew
not far away.
where Westview was very well. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there used to be this country club there when I was growing up, and now it was torn down, and it's now a big housing plan. But while it sat vacant when the country club went out of business, it got overgrown, and people would still walk their dogs up there. 'Cause people just started going up, figuring nobody's going to kick them off because they're going to walk your dog. People would be walking these small dogs, and out of the underbrush would dart these coyotes and snatch them off the leash and keep running. And it happened several times. And then I had a coyote bite my garbage can lid. There's a full, like a 4 or 5 inch in my old garbage can. It bit, and you could see the canine teeth puncture through, and it tried to tear the lid off. Those things
Now
are
that
everywhere.
sounds more like a coyote because
Yeah.
they're the catfish of the
Yeah.
canid world. But yeah, wow, you're the first person I've ever heard that has had in this area coyotes getting into the trash.
Yeah, no, they were really, and after they built the houses, then they kind of disappeared. But there was one not long ago. I saw one hit by a car on McKnight Road, and it was laying on the side of the road, and it was daylight. And I've seen them in North Park as well. And
Well,
it's one of those things where they're around, and more people are going to encounter them. So you can almost guarantee there's going to be some more folklore about this, more apprehension. Some people say they're harmless, other people say they're extremely dangerous. People are confused as to what the truth is. And
yeah.
then you have stories come up out of that.
Well, I know one of the wilder things I've ever seen, and I've personally thought it was unsettling. I know I've shared the photo with Brendan, who has something to say as well. Brendan, you recall I drove by a farm, and at that time they had just lifted the limit. I think you're allowed to shoot them as a pest now on a
Hmm.
farm. This person had like 7 coyotes hanging in the front yard. And I didn't know if they were supposed to make this like London Bridge and like just keep other coyotes away, because I took a photo. I was a little put off by it, to be honest with
Yeah.
you.
That's surprising. Yeah. I'm sure that person's a hoot. It's wild because I think that coyotes around here, when people first kind of hear about them, they're like, oh yeah, coyotes, you know. But like you said, Tom, like once you see them actually doing things and hearing these stories, it starts to kind of evolve. And then you hear that, like, okay, well, if there's coyotes, that means there's probably coy dogs and coy wolves, which are like
Yeah.
the hybrids between wolves and dogs, on both sides. I've never seen a coy wolf in the wild, but if I saw, probably looks a heck of a lot more like a wolf than a coyote when you see it, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where people start to talk and they start to think, okay, well, you know, nowadays for lots of good reasons, people treat, you know, their animals like children in some ways.
Yeah.
They're, as far as how protective and how much, you know, they really really care about them. I think you probably will start to see more and more folklore around, how to protect your, you know, your animals from them, both domestic livestock and domestic pets. I
Yeah.
think I know, especially out in the West Coast, for small dogs, they have those like spiky like jackets for, even for like birds of prey picking up
Yeah.
small animals. I wouldn't be shocked if we saw other less legitimate ways to do that, and then maybe are like the Sacramento
Yeah.
wax. And that kind of gets back to the whole idea of, I think, when you mentioned the utility of these stories at the time. But when it comes to the kind of like the overlap, like we mentioned, and all of this kind of like historical data, if we have so much of it and it does overlap so much with witches, especially, why aren't these stories more well known? Why do you think that this werewolf lore in Pennsylvania has been kind of, isn't as prevalent as maybe it should be, given how fun the stories are and how close it is to other things that do get a lot of traction?
Yeah, I think I have a couple ideas on that. First of all, I think, part of the thing with werewolves too, and this is kind of ties with what we just talked about with coyotes, is, coyotes now, are there, one of you mentioned, they're kind of seen as a pest animal, now in certain areas. And, a lot of the folklore about animals in general is about man controlling nature, right? Man, we've encroached in, and then there's problems, and
Right.
or nature encroaches back in some cases, and there's a problem. In this idea that man has to subjugate nature, to itself. And in the 1800s, wolves were still a major problem. In fact, some of the stories, there's other stories of, there aren't explicitly werewolf stories, like Elk Creek Gap in, I believe, Center County. There was, during the logging years, there were these things called
Hmm.
the spook wolves that would show up, and they
Oh,
would jump on those sledges full of trees, that had just been cut. And when any
yeah.
of those wolves was around, they weren't afraid of people, and they jump on the sledges. Even if their paw was touching it, the things couldn't move. The horses would pull and pull, and they couldn't move. If it took its paw off, they could move it. But then, these things would show up at night, a bunch of them. So it wasn't just like one where they could shoot and scare
Yeah.
them off. You get like 10 of them that would show up. And so then people just stopped doing the logging late into the evening. They got done early, and they didn't do it in that particular area. There's a place in,
Wow.
I think it was, let me look on my, Blair County had this. Speaking of the overlap between werewolves and wolves, again, this wasn't explicitly a werewolf, but it's kind of implied, where, because of how they kill it. But essentially in Blair County, in this place called Wolf Hollow, there was a farmer whose animals were being attacked by this wolf, this strange white wolf that would keep showing up and tearing the animals apart and then
Jeez.
leave. And so he, though, was a practitioner of this Pennsylvania German folk magic. And so in the folk magic tradition, you can make a magic circle to trap thieves and people that are taking your stuff. Well, he did that, and he set a trap and put an animal in, and the wolf showed up and couldn't get out of the circle. It was, when he came out in the morning, it was trapped in this magic circle.
That's
And
so cool.
he could tell it wasn't a normal wolf when he looked at it. So he killed it with a silver bullet. then the body was, displayed. They cut the skin off it and carried it through town to show that it was over. The town was probably like 5 houses, but still they carried it through, to show everyone that the wolf was done hunting their stuff. There's another case, that was a few years later, and I forget what county that was in. I have to take a look, but a similar case where they actually, this community was being haunted by a white wolf, again a white wolf, and they were going to hire a professional hunter from Germany, basically implying he's a werewolf hunter, because there were witch hunters you could hire, or this guy was a witch/werewolf hunter.
Right.
They were going to go and get him because the thing kept chasing people and killing people or killing animals. I'm sorry. And one day it chased these people into the church, and the minister slammed the door as the thing was trying to come in. And it turned because it couldn't come in, and it turned. He slammed the thing's tail on the door and ripped its tail off as he slammed the door. So then the thing would run around without a tail, and that's how they could identify it. But eventually, the community decides to hire this werewolf hunter, essentially. So the guy they send, whose last name was Rishel, they send to go get the werewolf hunter. And on the way, he meets this old woman who practices folk magic. And she says, "You don't need him. What you need to do is," basically, she gives him instructions to make the magic circle. And you have to go get a lamb that was born under a full moon, a dark lamb, like a black lamb or a dark wool lamb that was born under a full moon. Put it in the magic circle and wait, and then be ready to kill it. And if sure enough, the wolf comes in, they shoot it and kill it with a silver bullet. And eventually they cut its head off and put it on a pike as a display. But people said when they walk past it, the eyes would glow green still on the head, and the mouth might even open a little bit as this head was, mounted on this pole. But it shows, that these things were kind of like predators attacking the animals in a little more traditional werewolf fashion, and they were using magic to fight them.
I'd watch that.
Sounds like oh, go on.
I'd watch that movie. That is such a cool story.
It's a cool story, and it would make for a full movie because to be able to track down that lamb sounds like a real hassle.
Yeah, that's the hardest. Right. That's always, that's the thing with folk magic. I think sometimes they make it a little extra hard. That way, when it doesn't work, you're like, oh, you didn't do it right.
Right.
It's,
right.
Yeah.
But so that's the second one that you mentioned a white wolf. Yeah. Was there any correlation between white wolves and werewolves in these stories outside of those two, or is that just kind of happenstance? Because
I think it's kind of happenstance. I think they're always just something unique. They're either like all black or they're
or
all
extra big
white or something. Yeah. What I mean? I have a white werewolf story from the 80s up in Shenango, up near Shenango. There's a story where these during the Satanic Panic, where these people in this old house, they use this cult supposedly used this house, and they people would start seeing this big white wolf running around. They thought it was almost like a werewolf, and some people claimed to see it stand up on two legs, but it would never leave this area around this house. And the rumor was that these Satanists somehow summoned this, or this was one of them protecting whatever was going on in this abandoned house. And so people, it was kind of like a legend trip or legend thing, but people would claim to really see it. And then eventually when the house burned to the ground, no one ever saw the wolf again.
Well, there's a modern tale right there.
Yeah.
But it surprises me because there's so many taboos about killing an albino animal.
Yeah.
That it would really emphasizes what a problem it was being if they're willing to kind of break that taboo, because that seems to have been held on with regard to a bunch of different things.
Yeah. I mean, even today, if they often try to protect, if you see a white deer or stag or whatever, they try to protect it. Yeah. So
we had a white squirrel that lived in the neighborhood we named Daphne, and I was very sad when I didn't see Daphne at all last summer. She kicked around for a couple of years at least.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting, these stories. There's other stories too about like feral children. Sometimes these kids that are born with either hairy palms or feet, that was often supposedly a sign you were a werewolf, hair on your palms or your feet. And where there would be, there's a couple cases where these children would be either be born that act really animal-like, that go outside under a full moon, and no one was quite sure what made them this way. But eventually, when they hit like 13 or 14, they just run off in the woods and nobody ever sees them again.
Well, the story that we read from Shoemaker, which is from his 1911 Pennsylvania Mountain Stories, which I think is one of his earliest collections, and again, the Shoemaker preamble. But they go to a folk magic woman who basically says, "Hey, that's not a real wolf. That big black wolf that you're seeing. That's kind of protecting a specific area. It's the ghost of this person. You need to bury this person who was a murderer in the Lutheran cemetery. You do that, you'll see it no more." Lot less running around than getting the lamb, making sure the lamb was born up. But similar with regard to you need to follow a procedure to get rid of it, and the coloration as well. It's either the white wolf or the black wolf, abnormally large and whatnot. So, and again, there's also the aspect of having the folk magic practitioner giving the advice out. I'm kind of curious though, because now we've gone this long in the conversation and only now has full moons really being brought up. Where does the full moon aspect come into it?
I think that's more of a kind of a movie thing. It's, you don't see it a lot in folk. I imagine it's there somewhere. It's there somewhere in folklore. They're often witnessed under a moon, but maybe that's just because it's easier to see a wolf walking around.
Right.
The moon's
a little
full.
practical.
And you don't notice it's there. But yeah, it's not one of the essential things. Just like, there's ways to kill it without, or to stop a werewolf without the silver bullet. You don't need to have a silver bullet necessarily. And, there's the full moon's one of those things where I think it's kind of it doesn't factor into a lot of stories that I've read. Let's put it that way. And it's not the thing that triggers your transformation. Your transformation is either believed to be triggered from some kind of evil, or you do it voluntarily, or it's some kind of curse. It's not necessarily because of the moon.
Do we have any stories from the other side? Do we have stories from people who claim to be either practitioners of like dark magic or werewolves, or have intimate knowledge of werewolves in the folklore, like we have of like evil versions of witches or whatever?
As far as European folklore, I'm pretty sure there were some confessions at some point. I'm not off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm.
I can't recall the specifics. In Pennsylvania, you have you definitely have witches that admitted to it, but not too many will admit it. I mean, there's cases.
Right.
Weirdly enough, stories I've heard of people who are actually at least claimed to be werewolves or something have all been from the past 30 or 40 years. And
interesting.
yeah, and there's a couple, and a lot of them are actually from up in here Mercer County area, or that region. One is actually kind of a funny story. It's actually from the werewolf's nephew. The werewolf's nephew told me a story. It's not. This is kind of funny, but it's in this area called Pardo. It was a former grad student of mine. He told me about how his uncle was, ever since he was a little kid, was obsessed with werewolves and like Dracula and Universal monsters. And so for years, like when he was a kid, he'd dress up like a werewolf. Even when it wasn't Halloween, he'd run around. And he kept doing it as an adult. He'd be out running in the woods and it would scare people. But eventually people figured out, oh, it's just this guy dressed as a werewolf running around. Yeah, he's perfectly normal the rest of the time, but this is what he does. Like he dresses up and runs around. But I often wonder if some of those werewolf sightings up in that area in the 60s and 70s wasn't him.
That's fascinating.
I would love that to be the case. I would love that, because that is one of those times where it's like, people always say there's probably a very mundane explanation to this.
Yeah.
And yeah, as Brendan says, oh, that's Steve.
Yeah, yeah. But, there's another case, though, when I had first heard this, and it's one of those things where I have no proof any of this is real, but, I had first heard this when I worked at the Heinz History Center years ago, where someone came in and was asking me all these questions about a supposed cult, and it might have been related to that white werewolf story, but I think they thought it was a different part. It wasn't the same. I don't think it's the same story. Maybe they influenced each other, but supposedly, and somebody would come in and ask me about south of Sharon, PA, that there was this group of Satanists who are also werewolves. They completely believed, they would tell people they were werewolves. They lived there was like 4 or 5 of them who lived up in a cabin somewhere. They would come into town together or come in and do stuff, and everyone thought they were weird, and they were kind of like sort of bikerish, but and I heard these stories. This person came in and they were from that area, and they wanted to know if we had any legends about werewolves or anything. And back then I was just beginning to explore a lot of this stuff, and so I'm like, I really don't have any information on that, you know. But eventually, years went by, and someone else talked to me at an event and brought it up again. It completely unconnected to the first person. And they started talking about this like cult of werewolves near south of Sharon somewhere in that region. And then a third person brought it up one time at a different event. And he said, yeah, my cousin ran with those people. And he said they claim they're werewolves. And that's, you know, and it was like, but he didn't have any more information. But that's, I tried to get like, you know, but he was like, that's all I'm going to say. And, you know, they leave, you know, and then.
I'm not totally surprised by this, just because I've met some weird people out there. And I remember there were a lot of people claiming to be vampires. I remember some TV show.
Oh, yeah.
They were, and they even like, they tested him like, no, you don't need blood to survive. And he looked disappointed, crestfallen, really. Yeah. But I think about now that horses aren't so prominent, you know, were they like just stealing people's cars and then leaving them without any gas in the tank when people got out? What sort of shenanigans are they up to? Are they looking cool?
Well, it's just like two things. One less serious and one more serious, question-wise. The less serious one is like, if either of you have ever known anyone who is into like Vampire the Masquerade, people who are into some of these, like whether they're games, subcultures, whatever, from a sociological standpoint, are very committed and into those things, and the lines kind of blur in some ways. Like the mundane explanation, I think, is probably just what you guys just kind of mentioned, that like maybe these people were there, but having three different people mention it to you over the years. Again, from a folklore standpoint, does that kind of legitimize that as actually being folklore in that area?
Yeah, you know, I think it probably which there's got to be more stories. The chance of me encountering three random this thing I barely ever heard of, and I've scoured the state for all kinds of stories. Yeah, but I still always hear new ones. So there's always stuff going on, and I think in all the stories I hear is like it took place like the early '90s, late '90s. Which you mentioned that Masquerade game. There was a werewolf game too, I think, and those were all popular in the 90s.
I'm sure. Yeah,
like that would be right around that time. You know, kind of like the kind of resurgence of like goth culture during that time. And you had, you know, so that's what I always thought too. Are these people, is it just kind of small town area? These people are actually probably normal. They just purposely act weird, or they identify as, you know, something, and it's just created this legend around them.
Right.
Or, you know, is it just, you know,
which is kind of cool from a role playing standpoint, like as like someone who's into role playing for D&D and stuff like that. Like, those folks would probably be so stoked to hear that like a folklorist heard about them, you know?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
I would agree with that, because south of Sharon, of course, is like, but New Wilmington, which is a very, you know, it's that sort of place. And I would imagine, being young, maybe that's how you rebel against that, because we all wear those masks from time to time. But they definitely enjoyed, I'm sure, if they knew that people would be talking about them like that. I'm kind of curious, because you've mentioned witches a lot, and you're not going to say anything about it, but I will say that you have at least one book of Witches of Pennsylvania, and if anybody hasn't checked that out, I would really recommend it. It's a really good read. I enjoy it, and some of the things that we spoke about are mentioned in there as well. Are there any other stories that you brought to the table tonight that you haven't been able to say, or is there just any other ideas about the werewolf lore of Pennsylvania that you wanted to get them across?
Yeah, and since you mentioned Witches of PA real quick, I also mentioned I have a book, Supernatural Lore of Pennsylvania, which has werewolf stories in it. And then I have another book on witchcraft, Witch of the Monongahela, about Mulderry and folk magic in southwestern PA. But yeah, there are a couple. It's interesting that the werewolf stories have continued into the modern era. They're a little different, and often they get lumped with like Bigfoot stuff, right? But there's been some cases in Pennsylvania in the past 20 years of alleged werewolf encounters. One in Westmoreland County, where this werewolf supposedly crossed a road and looked at a car. One out at Westchester University, supposedly twice werewolves were seen near the campus and chased some students around. and and there's up near like Sharon, Hermitage, that whole area, starting like the 60s, the kind of Wolf Boy of the Shenango Valley, but there's some
Right.
other alleged sightings up there. So there's a lot of stuff that still continues with this, right? It hasn't gone away. And I think it tends to cycle through. There's times when it's not as interesting, it might come back. 'Cause we tend to, the monsters always come back in a different form, or there might be something similar, like, I don't know. I don't know what it'll be. That's the great thing about folklore. You don't know what it's going to turn into as far as monster wise. But the one thing I did want to make sure I told everybody though is how to stop the werewolf attack when you're attacked.
Yes, you promised this.
Yeah.
The practical application of this conversation, yes.
So if you are walking out late one night in the woods of Pennsylvania and you find yourself being stalked by a werewolf, first of all, it's always good to carry something like, a knife or something with a cane or a sword cane or a point, as one does, or, has something sharp, because the idea is, and you can see the folk magic influence in this, but the idea is if you're confronted with a werewolf and it's approaching you, if you can, you got really, the only place you're going to be able to do this is the face where the most blood vessels are, right? If you can prick it or poke it in the face and make it bleed before it gets to you, it'll turn back. You draw blood first from the wolf. If you draw blood first from the wolf, it will return to its human form and you'll be safe.
Well, that fits a lot of the stories you mentioned too. Okay. Yeah. So that's new. I've never heard that before.
But it also
let's not forget the blessed bullets too.
Yeah, and those are good as backup. Yeah, that's those also
as
work
a first defense. Yeah.
But if you're out of the blessed bullets, you draw blood from the werewolf first. So
that's just sound advice.
Yeah.
Well, Thomas White, how can people find you? How can people find your books?
Sure, my books are on like Amazon, Barnes and Noble. They're in a lot of the pharmacies, Rite Aids, Targets. They're in all over the place anymore. The publisher gets them all over. So, but Amazon, Barnes and Noble are easy places to get it. I mean, it is the History Press. Arcadia publishes them, so that's you can get them directly from the publisher. And people can reach me. I mean, I just often tell people I don't do a lot of social media stuff anymore, just because it's kind of grueling, and it's so I do have a Facebook page, and people can find my face. I think Witch of the Monongahela is the current backdrop picture. So if you see that, you have the right Thomas White. Or people can contact me on there, or email me at my work email. I mean, I do history and folklore and run archives for a living. So I work at Duquesne University. Look me up at the directory, Duquesne University, and my email will be right there. Send me an email, and I'll get back to you and talk to you about your legend or your folklore.
Well, I really mean this very sincerely, really cannot thank you enough for this conversation, because, again, we have been talking about and anticipating and hoping to have this conversation about werewolves since we said goodbye last time, because we were just so intrigued by it, because, again, just was not familiar. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on.